Good morning, my beauties. I hope everyone's having a good morning today. Um, as you do, I spent the other night just scrolling through different crime type websites and kind of just tried something new. I tried searching blatantly random phrases like cracker barrel murder or cow pie killers just to try and stir up something new, something that I might not have seen or forgotten about. Well, I didn't find anything that perfect, but I did come across a super interesting website, and that would be deathpenaltyinfo.org. Straight to the point. I love it. And when they say info, they mean info. I came here simply just for the quote upcoming executions tab, to be completely honest. I'm sure that won't come across dark for those of you like us, but for those who don't understand, it's simply a curiosity thing. I'm not, like trying to watch people get murdered. But before I go any further, I'm not here to give my opinion one way or another in regards to the death penalty. To be completely truthful, I'm kind of on the fence about it. I hate stories of innocent people facing death for someone else's crimes, something they're innocent for. Plus, is fighting fire with fire really the right way? But then on other days, I read stories of child murderers and sex offenders, and I'm like, yep, kill the fucker. So I think it's a little bit of a tough line to walk, but that's just my 2 cents. Anyways, I tell you this because the criminal focus of today is currently awaiting his last meal. Michael A. Tisius. Before we go any further into him, I want to talk a little bit more about the death penalty itself, but in a completely factual based sense. This site just has so much good information, and it would honestly be rude of me not to share it. So I feel like I should start with a quote from their history tab, just so we're all on the same page. And it goes, quote, "The death penalty has existed in the United States since colonial times. Its history is intertwined with slavery, segregation, and social reform movements." End quote. And as with many law issues, race plays pivotal points throughout history. But there are so many other people out there much better suited to fully elaborate as to how these two histories are specifically woven together. Although I do hope to show you at least a snippet of this said history, since it's truly astounding and frustrating all at once. So, quickly, here are just 5 studies done within the past 20 years on race and the death penalty, and how they quote unquote coexist. So, number one, jurors in Washington state are 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a black defendant than for a white defendant in a similar case. Study number two, in Louisiana, the odds of a death sentence were 97% higher for those whose victim was white rather than for those whose victim was black. A study in California, number three, found that those convicted of killing whites were more than 3 times as likely to be sentenced to death as those convicted of killing blacks, or more than 4 times more likely as those convicted of killing Latinos. So clearly, we see a trend already. Study number four. A study of the death penalty in North Carolina found that the odds of receiving a death sentence rose by 3.5 times among those defendants whose victims were white. Study number five, the final one. In 96% of states where there have been reviews of race and the death penalty, there is a pattern of either race of victim or race of defendant discrimination or both. So it's all over the United States. This is just 5 very small examples of individual states. But doesn't it just blow your mind? Like, obviously, I knew there was a connection, but to this degree and still today, you know what? Maybe I'm not such a fence sitter anymore. So, on a little bit of a lighter note, let's just touch on exonerations a bit. Since the early 70s, just over 190 prisoners have been exonerated from death row. And of these 190, would you like to take a guess at which state has the most? It's Florida, which definitely surprised me right away. I'm like, oh, way to go, Florida. You're doing well getting people off death row." But then I thought about it for a moment, and now I'm just thinking that they're most likely just a very trigger happy state, so to speak, when it comes to sentencing. Clearly, their quote beyond reasonable doubt threshold is much lower than in other places. So sorry, Florida. There's just a little bit of extra shade. And speaking of Florida, the amount of extra money that this state spends on the death penalty is ludicrous. I mean, it's abhorrently expensive all around the US again, and Florida just might have a special budget. According to my new favorite site, Florida has spent an average of $51 million extra each year since 1976 to enforce the death penalty, which amounts to roughly $2.4 billion, which is crazy, right? But then I kept reading. Since 1978, California has spent over $4 billion on capital punishment. This blows Florida out of the water with an average of an extra $89 million per year in taxpayer money. Right, but at least they have the rest of their taxes and living costs under control, right? Just to wrap it up here, this last bit I completely agree with, but as to who said it surprised me. A poll done in 2009 surveying police chiefs found that these police chiefs, quote, considered the death penalty the least efficient use of taxpayer money, end quote. Now, maybe these police officers just wanted more funding for themselves, but I digress. So I hope that didn't bore you too much. We can get to the good now, I promise. Michael A. Tisius, who are you? I was positive I had never heard this before because I swear I would remember a story this bananas. So let me take you back to June of 2000, almost 23 years ago. 19-year-old Michael Tisius had just been sentenced to jail for 30 days. On what charge exactly? I'm unsure, but according to the Daily Journal, he had been jailed twice previously for similar charges, such as stealing and theft. And it was here in the Randolph County Jail in Huntsville, Missouri, that he met 27-year-old Roy Vance. This guy now, he had a much more decorated history. Since 1991, Vance had been in and out of jail basically nonstop. In his hometown of Macon, I should have looked that up, shouldn't I? Uh, in his hometown, Sheriff Robert Dawson has said that, quote, Vance had been in his jail 15 times on charges related to bad checks, probation violations, and damage to public property, end quote. And that's just one of the many jails that he frequented over the years. So I'm not sure about you, but this Roy boy doesn't seem like the kind of person I would generally associate with or want to make friends with. But that's not how Tisius saw it. Oh no. Before long, these two were absolutely buddy-buddy. As they got to know each other, Vance informed Tisius that his latest sentence, carried a weight of 51 years, literally 612 times longer than Tisius's. And yet somehow, Vance was able to convince this young 19-year-old to help scheme his escape. He must have been one charming dude, or looked a lot like his dad, maybe, because I don't know how you go from meeting someone in jail to agreeing to help them escape in under a month. It blows my mind. Anyways, with not much time remaining on the 30-day jail stint, these geniuses started to plan. After what was an, I'm sure, intense brainstorming session, this is what our boys came up with. So, quote, Tisius was to return to the jail with a firearm, force the guards into a cell, and give the gun to Vance, who would then take charge and release all of the inmates, end quote. And then I wrote, look out, Shawshank. Roy and Mikey are in town. I mean, it's absurd. So, just to let you a little in on my life a bit, a year and a half ago or so, I got pulled over and arrested on a dumb little marijuana charge in South Dakota, and I ended up spending 3 days in jail, right? I So there was plenty of nice people in there, don't get me wrong. But my cellmate at the time, when he got put in the cell with me, he was coming down from some sort of ridiculous high, kept punching the walls, telling me that he was going to kill his girlfriend when he got out of there. And I wouldn't want to help him escape. I mean, the fact that these two became friends in that short amount of time, I did not want to associate at all with my cellmate. I would play chess with a few people to pass the time, but that was about it. I'm not coming back, that's for sure. Alas, on June 13th, Michael was released from jail. And shockingly, he kept to this quote plan. Immediately, he contacted Roy Vance's girlfriend, Tracy Bewlington, who was apparently just as scummy as these two fools. Tisius filled her in on the plan, and she was sold. Just days after, with the help of a woman named Heather Douglas, Tracy drove from Macomb to Columbia to pick up Tisius, who must have headed that way after being released from jail. So, during the ride back to Heather's house, where the two would end up crashing for about 5 days, presumably since her place was closest to the Huntsville jail housing Roy Vance, or the fact that these other two didn't have any place to live. Either way, Tisius and Tracy Beelington were steadfast to break Roy out. So starting on June 17th, 2000, they began the most undoubtedly preposterous scheme in Missouri's history. Over the next 4 days and nights, these two good for nothings spent their time visiting the Huntsville jail, talking to the guards on duty, and bringing Roy Boy his treats like cigarettes and socks. It was later revealed in court testimony that these little gifts were apparently messages. Quote, Bewlington testified that each delivery signified to Vance certain facts, such as that Tisius had made it to town or that the jailbreak would not occur the night of the delivery, end quote. This is honestly the only comprehensible piece of their plan, but I also think she could have made it up in court just to sound smarter than she is for the public eye. Okay, so obviously these two were scoping the place out, trying to get more comfortable with the building from the outside, not inside of a cell, and maybe schmoozing up to the guards to try and have them loosen up over time or over a few days. But that behavior did not go unnoticed. Apparently, during one visit, Bewlington and Tisius were acting so odd that a guard felt compelled to write a police report after the fact. It turns out that Tisius had been sneaking in a 22 caliber handgun stolen from Tracy's parents during some of these visits. And my thinking is that the night that the guard made the report was also the first time Tisius had brought the weapon in with him to the jail, and he was probably just extremely nervous, and that's why his behavior was a little bit erratic. Anyways, on the evening of June 21st, it appeared as if Tisius had finished warming up. His last check was to test the firearm by shooting it out of a moving vehicle that Tracy was driving. Sheer intellect, I tell you. And to amp themselves up even more, Tracy and Michael Tisius blasted the song Mo Murder or More Murder repeatedly on the way to the jailhouse that night. It was at this point he allegedly told Tracy that, quote, he had to do what he had to do with a blaze of glory, end quote. And so, roughly 12:15 a.m. the following morning, Bewlington and Tisius arrived at the jail one final time. It was said that Tisius made small talk with the two present guards for 10 minutes or so, and before long, Bewlington noticed that he had the weapon drawn at his side. According to her testimony, she felt that she wanted to back out at this point, but it was too late, much too late. Tisius raised his arm, pistol in hand, and, quote, from a distance of 2 to 4 feet, shot Acton in the forehead above his left eye, killing him instantly. Egley began to approach Tisius, and about 10 seconds after he killed Acton, Tisius shot Egley one or more times from a distance of 4 or 5 feet until Egley fell to the ground. Both officers were unarmed, end quote. So Jason Acton, one of the officers who was 36 at the time, he was fresh to the force, having been with the department only 2 months at the time of his death. And then there was Leon Egley, who was just a little bit younger, 33. And he also served as a councilman for the city. And for years, this man had pushed for better jail security. We'll get a little bit more into that later. So the next part after these two brutal murders is pure chaos and further proves that these criminals' absolute lack of intelligence. Tisius then grabbed the first set of keys he could find in the dispatch area, ran to Roy Vance's cell, and failed to find the right key. I could just imagine him fumbling with all the keys jingling. Vance is in there yelling, "Come on, man, hurry up." Anyways, he couldn't get him out, so he ran back to the dispatch area to find another set of keys to try. Meanwhile, Beelington was just standing there, frozen in disbelief. As Egley, clinging onto his life, he made one final attempt and grasped at her legs. Tisius saw this and shot the officer several more times. At this point, the two gave up on their rescue plan. He didn't even try a second set of keys and immediately fled the scene after that one pathetic attempt to get Roy Vance out of the cell door. I mean, they had initially planned to lock these two up, or planned, I say lightly, to lock the guards up in a separate cell, let Vance out, and then let all of the inmates out. And they got in the door, killed two people, couldn't get a single person out. Obviously, I'm happy they failed, but he literally murdered two people and barely even tried to finish the plan. Pitiful. Just all for naught. So all in all, Jason Acton, who was killed first, he was shot once in the head, while Leon Egley, he endured one shot to the shoulder, one to the cheek, and three to the forehead. Just pure brutality. Immediately, a manhunt ensued, and within a day, remember, these two are dumber than fuck. Within a day, Tisius and Beelington were arrested after her car broke down just over the Kansas state line. The jail keys and murder weapon had been recovered almost immediately, along with those two. And investigators really didn't need much more than that, I guess. Tisius immediately waived his rights and gave written and oral confessions for the two murders, although he claimed he should only be responsible for second-degree murder because he committed the murders without, quote, deliberation, end quote. Again, the brains this man has, I envy. Beelington, she also ended up pleading guilty to 2 counts of murder, and she received a life sentence. And as far as I can tell, she does remain in custody, which is nice to hear. However, this was not the case for Michael Tisius, having been the man responsible for pulling the trigger, and honestly, kind of the whole reason we're here today. Tisius received the death penalty, which is why I found him under the upcoming executions on that deathpenaltyinfo.org site. And now, nearly 25 years later, his time is approaching. So his execution, which I love, it's such a gnarly word, is set for 6 p.m. on June 6th of this year. I mean, there's always the possibility of extra filings or proceedings, but it might not be looking too good for him at this point. And finally, for their third member, Heather Douglas, she was not part of the plan. I don't think she was charged at all. I couldn't really find anything prominent around her, but she testified against those two in court, clearly not wanting anything to do with them, was simply there to give a ride to maybe a friend or a stranger in need, and ended up in the mix with these two idiots, bumbling buffoons. But let's forget about Tisius and Roy Vance and Tracy for a minute. Remember when I mentioned the jail security issue? Well, it was no tiny thing. So I found this quote from the Daily Journal, and it goes, "Nothing separates visitors from deputies in the jail's lobby." And Sheriff Ansell closed the jail after the fatal shootings until a bulletproof barrier could be put up. So you could just walk in and assault anyone you wanted in there that wasn't inside of a jail cell. And 3 times over the past 2 years, oh my goodness gracious, Randolph County voters rejected ballot measures to replace the 91-year-old building with a new jail. So since this terrible, terrible tragedy, they have moved into a bigger and better building. But yet again, nothing changes until after something terrible happens. 23 years later, and we still aren't even remotely trying to become more proactive as a nation. Like, oh yeah, yeah, we'll get around to it. We'll get around to it. Anyways, do I think Tisius should be executed? He did murder two innocent people in cold blood simply because a stranger he barely knew asked him to. I mean, I don't want him alive, right? See you later!